I'm Eleanor Griggs, the NFU Land Management Advisor. Louise is obviously the Senior Rural Surveyor for the NFU. I'm going to start off with the Agriculture Bill and the tenancy reform provisions that have been included in that. The main clauses which have been included, I've listed on this slide here, but the one I want to focus on today that sort of fits in with the theme of what Greg has been talking about is the ability of a tenant to challenge a landlord's refusal when it comes to giving consent for the variation of terms within a tenancy. And that gives the tenant the ability to go to arbitration should a landlord refuse to vary certain terms within a tenancy, either just on a one-off occasion or sort of ongoing. So it is obviously, because it would go through the arbitration process, it has to be subject to the test of reasonableness. So a tenant farmer would have to demonstrate that it would be reasonable for a landlord to give consent because it will assist the farming business to go forward. It focuses mainly on those clauses which are restrictive to the tenancy and are potentially sort of productively prohibitive. So it stops you as a tenant farmer from doing something which is productive for your business on your farm. If I could move on, please, to the next slide. Thank you. So the variation of clauses, it is only available for certain things. It's not widely available for anything you might think would assist your business. I've highlighted the relevant bits on the slide there in green. So you can only use it in the event that the restrictive clause prevents you from applying for relevant financial assistance, or it prevents you from complying with a statutory duty. So when I talk about or mention relevant financial assistance, they are things listed at the beginning of the Agriculture Bill, and then mainly the things which are classed as public goods. So soil protection, improvement of managing water improvement, land improvement, improving the environment, supporting public access to the countryside, all of those kinds of things. And then with statutory compliance, we'd be looking at things like complying with whatever slurry storage requirements there are at the time, or sort of livestock buildings for welfare purposes, etc., things like that. In most tenancies, both the old style traditional Agricultural Holdings Act tenancies and with the newer farm business tenancies, most of those written tenancy agreements will contain a clause requiring the tenant to farm in accordance with good estate management and good husbandry. Now, quite a few options within the proposed ELMS scheme will potentially fall outside of those definitions of good estate management and good husbandry. So even if there doesn't happen to be a clause in your agreement saying you can't do this, it may be caught up with the good estate management and good husbandry restrictions. This is where the ability to challenge your landlord's consent would really come into play. What you do have to think about as well is that, as I said, it does only apply to the financial assistance and statutory compliance. It's not for things like allowing diversification, non-agricultural diversification. It's not for things like improving or erecting a building which would be good for your business, but is not necessary and doesn't fall into the financial assistance scope. If I could move on to the next slide, thank you. Unfortunately, the ability to challenge on restrictive clauses is limited to the AHA traditional tenancies. There's no equivalent clause in the Agriculture Bill for farm business tenancies. We did challenge this. We had discussions with DEFRA to try to see what their thinking was behind not putting FBTs in there as well. And we did as well put forward an amendment to the Agriculture Bill to allow farm business tenants to also be able to challenge a restrictive clause. Our thinking behind that is that certainly for longer term farm business tenancies, they may have issues in accessing ELMS because they will have quite similar restrictions in those tenancy agreements as AHA tenancies. They're still likely to be subject to farming in accordance with good estate management and good husbandry, etc. So we couldn't see necessarily the difference between AHA and FBT, certainly the longer term ones, in that sense. So we do have concerns with that. Could I move on to the next slide, please? Thank you. This slide is slightly out of date from the presentation I gave last week because Trigg has now met on Friday last week. Trigg is the tenancy reform industry group, for those of you that don't know. It's made up of various stakeholder groups within the industry, so the NFU, the CLA, the TFA, RICS, CAAV, etc., etc. So the way it works is that DEFRA or government, if they are looking for ideas or proposals on something to do with tenancy law or practice, they will give instruction to Trigg to go away, discuss and come back with proposals, basically. We've been meeting since 2017 in preparation for all of this, with consultations, etc. In the meantime, we were called back, as I said last week, because DEFRA now want to look at Trigg's input into creating and shaping the new regulations that will be required to implement the new tenancy reform provisions. Most notably, they will be for the suitability test, the new suitability test under the Agricultural Holdings Act, and also on the ability to challenge restrictive clauses. So looking at how the regulation will work, and then obviously DEFRA will take those proposals away and draft the regulations. We were also instructed to continue work that was kind of put on hold really with COVID in terms of updating guidance and sources of advice that are out there for tenants. We also, and this isn't on the slide, we were also told at that meeting that the Trigg proposals from 2017 that went to government but didn't make it into the Agriculture Bill, we will be looking at those again and discussing those as a group. We weren't given any commitment by DEFRA as to what would then happen with those proposals, whether they would then look at legislating further to implement some of those. They were the more contentious proposals, but they do include obviously the issue we have with longer term farm business tenants in their ability to challenge their landlord over the variation of a restrictive clause. And on that note, I am now going to pass over to Louise to take you through the next steps. Thank you.
Thanks, Eleanor, and thanks, Greg, for the earlier presentation. Morning, all. Yeah, so I'm going to try and explain a little bit more, pick up on some of the things that Greg has mentioned. So first of all, lump sum payments. DEFRA are still looking at offering a one-off lump sum payment. It's to be, and if it is taken, it will be in place of all remaining direct payments through the transition period. So you know that we've got sort of, it looks like 7 years of transition. Yeah, and it will be the lump sum. If you take it, it will be now paid up front. What is slightly different from when we first knew about lump sums is that DEFRA are now looking at it that it will be an exit payment. So you will only be able to take it if you do want to exit out of farming. We had a meeting a few weeks ago with DEFRA to try and look at what any of the barriers might be to you as a tenant if you were wanting to take this lump sum, and what the criteria would be going forward to actually be able to take the lump sum. We know that they are going to determine the lump sum on a reference year, and the reference year will be times by a factor. That's all we know at the moment in regard to how it will be calculated. We did get asked, should there be a maximum payment on it? And we said no. Then they also asked who should be eligible for it. We've obviously said, yeah, it should be the farmer. So if it is the farmer, then it will be you as the tenant. We had a little bit of a discussion around, you know, when was it going to be available and how will farmers be able to apply. It's looking like it might be next year, but they are, as on the last bullet point here, as I've said, going to consult on it, and we're waiting to hear something announced this November. We do have concerns about what is the tax treatment going to be on the lump sum payments. You know, depending on what they decide, you know, the tax treatment could make it not even worthwhile taking. And then finally there, I think for you, and if you are thinking about exiting, you are going to know all the factors before you decide to exit and whether you want to take the lump sum payment. When I say all factors, I mean that is in regard to what is going to be happening with how BPS is phased out and what are the payments going to be under ELMS. Okay, please could we move to the next slide? Thank you. So delinking, some of you will also have been hearing about delinking. So yes, DEFRA have this plan to delink direct payments from the land for all farmers. Once delinked, recipients will no longer have to farm in order to receive any payments during transition. So, you know, yeah, going forward, there'll be no need to have land or any entitlements to receive the delinking payment. DEFRA believe they have other consultations they've done in past. This delinking meets the simplification that people have been asking for. And then they've said as well, there'll be no restrictions then going forward on how delinking payments, you can spend those delinked payments. Yeah, I think is absolutely right. The earliest they've said they think that they'll be able to bring in delinking is not until 2022. Again, a bit like the lump sum, they're going to use a reference year to enable this. And actually, it is only going to be available to you as a tenant farmer, you know, if you have received BPS in the past, because obviously the reference year is going to be based on something in the past. So yeah, as I've said on the last bullet point here, a new entrant then is not going to be able or eligible to receive a D-linked payment. Okay, could we just go on to the next slide, please? So I thought, just having some of those things in mind about lump sums, delinking, what Greg was saying earlier about BPS being phased out, and then ELMS, I just really wanted to focus a little bit more on rent that you as a tenant will be paying. I think what's really important is that you all start to think about what is actually paying your rent. So are you using your BPS money that's coming in to pay your rent? Are you already in an environmental stewardship scheme and part of that is used? Yes, is it as well the income that you're getting from your crops or livestock? Do you have a diversification project and you rely heavily on that to pay your rent? I think all of those 4 factors there really need to be considered. Why I'm saying they need to be considered is because, as Greg has mentioned, and you're now becoming very aware, BPS is going to be phased out. We know what the percentage phasings is going to be for next year. We're just waiting now to receive what they're likely to be for 2022 and 2023. I think that's going to really help you all to be able to plan. But I think there's nothing stopping you already, knowing that we know what the rates are for next year. So just to remind you that there's a 5% cut on BPS up to 30,000 for next year, 10% on 30,000 up to 50,000, and 20% on 50,000 up to 150,000. We actually did some figures on somebody that was receiving a payment of 72,000. So for next year, if you normally, like this year, had received 72,000, next year you will actually only receive just over 64,000. We then actually guessed on what some percentages that might be for 2022 and 2023. And again, we then got down to a figure of the person who's receiving 72,000 this year, by 2023 might only actually be receiving just over 52,000. So as you can see, that was just us putting, putting some figures in to a spreadsheet just to see what happens. And I think there's nothing stopping you, all of you, doing that, so you can see what happens there. I think then what's really important is so that if you know what your rent is and how you're paying it, if you know that you're really relying on your BPS, I mean, if BPS is going down and then we've got a gap before the ELMS starts, the also thing that has to be considered is that ELMS, when it starts, if you don't happen to be in a pilot and you've got to wait for the main rollout, which isn't going to be to 2024, ELMS is not also going to replace your full BPS payment in any way. So you do need to consider how going forward you are going to be able to pay your rent. If we could just go to the next slide, please. So what I've done here is I've just got 2 slides showing whether you're on a traditional AHA, Agricultural Holdings Act tenancy, or whether you're on FBT. I'll show you that slide in a moment. I think it's really important to remember how the rent should be calculated. So if you're on a traditional AHA tenancy, it's supposed to be calculated this way, as set out here. So it's the rent at which the holding might reasonably be expected to be let by a prudent and willing landlord to a prudent and willing tenant, and the rent properly payable taking into account all relevant factors. And under an AHA, the relevant factors are as listed there: the terms of the tenancy, the character and situation of the holding, productive capacity, related earning capacity, then comparable rents, and marriage value. So this is why normally under an AHA you will hear people say, yeah, you must know what your budgets are for your farm, because that's how you're going to know what your productive capacity and related earning capacity is. You have to remember as stated at the bottom here, it's a hypothetical tenant under this definition, and that you're assumed to be competent in practicing a suitable farming system. So it doesn't necessarily have to be what you are actually doing on your holding. I think if you have received a rent review even this year, or you've just had a notice served on you for next year, because we do know that some tenants have, and you are an AHA, and you've been given any comparables, please make sure you go back to your landlord or your landlord's agent and get the details of that comparable, because it's really important to make sure that what the comparables they've highlighted are actually comparables. So that's why I'm saying please go and ask for the detail. Then if we could just go on to FBTs. Again, most of you will be very well aware that the difference then between a traditional AHA and an FBT is that the review of the definition on rent is that actually under an FBT, it's the rent properly payable in respect of the holding between a willing landlord to a willing tenant, and it's at a market rent. Again, comparables are important, so comparing rents of other similar holdings, and again, relevant factors have to be taken into account of your tenancy, because FBT tenancies can be different. So you must, make sure that any terms in your tenancy are taking into account. And again, as I've said, under traditional agricultural holding act tenancies, if you've been given some comparables and you've just been given figures, please do make sure that you ask for the details of those comparables to see whether they really are comparable to your holding. Obviously, you're going to have to try and find out if you have had a notice now for next year, what other rents are. If you're on an estate, what are other people paying? I think it's important for you to try and find that out. If you can't find it out yourself, then you will need to have an agent, as they will be able to obtain comparables more easily. And I think this is where I'm saying also then you need to bring up, to your landlord that obviously BPS is going to be phased out. So you are not going to have the income in that budget that you originally had. So I think that will impact what rents are going to be going forward. And obviously we're still waiting at the moment to see what the payments are going to be under ELMS. We've just had, just to give you a few examples, I know there's a group of tenants on one of the county farm estates. They've had quite a few notices. Some have had just had their rent reviewed now, this October, September. Some have had notices for next year. So we do know there are notices out there being served by landlords. So it is really important that you spend some time on knowing, what your income is, what you get from your BPS, that type of thing, so you know what you are going to be able to pay. And remember that you're normally paying something going forward for 3 years before your rent can be reviewed again. And I do think it's really important, as Greg said, he is going to be doing those one-to-one surgeries. So please, I would absolutely say, please do take up that offer, because every bit of help that you can get is definitely going to be beneficial. Okay, and I'll finish there. Thank you.